Okay, great. So I'm Evan Baars from NMG Consulting. I was not prepared for the question, and I actually prepared for the previous one. So look, it's a 15-minute slot. It's food for thought. I'm going to go quickly. I'm going to try not to kind of speed it up too much, but I'm very comfortable. If you've got questions, just reach out, LinkedIn, email, however. Very comfortable to just go into all of the detail with you offline. So as part of the work we do at NMG Consulting, we interview a lot of advisors, financial advisors like yourselves, and potentially some of yourselves. You might see quotes up on the screen. We interview advisors in the UK, in Australia, in North America, in Asia, et cetera, but of course in South Africa as well. So what you're going to see here is really focused. It's two main slides. The first slide is really focused on South African financial advisors that we've been interviewing this year, and it asks around, what kind of evolutions or changes to your business have you been making? And hopefully that'll be interesting. And then the next slide brings it to potential future innovations, potential future evolution, and compares a lot of those trends to the UK. So the question here was really, what evolutions to your business have you made? Now, they were open text answers, and we're going to categorize them as you see on the graph. So you can see kind of technology, clients in the various buckets. But we will bring that into the very kind of specific quotes. And I've made the font size about as big as possible, so hopefully you'll be able to read the quotes as they pop up. I think before we get into that, though, it's worth acknowledging that if you're still operating as a business, if you still got clients, if you still got assets or risk sales or whatever you're doing, if you're still doing that post-COVID, then you made it, right? There was a level of evolution, of innovation, and success just to still be operating post-COVID. And so I think that's the first one, just flagging, because we don't put it on the chart, but I think it's a very important one to acknowledge. All right, so we're going to split technology into two types of technology, and it's very interesting to hear the previous speakers and just how this kind of actually links in together, because I didn't see what they were going to say beforehand. But so the first one we've really seen a lot of is around client-facing technology. Call it customer experience. But so we've seen a lot of discussion around communications or reporting. One advisor said, I'm communicating more with my client, I've professionalized the way I'm doing it, I brought my branding into the reporting, and I'm increasingly showing them they're tracking against their plan. And this advisor did this specifically to try and improve customer retention. Other technology, and we'll talk about all of these more on the next slide, but other technology, just as an example, would be, well, basically it's a bucket for everything that's not customer, but other technology would include things like systems and processes and making it more efficient. It would include CRM systems, which will also tie into the client level that we're going to talk about as well. But that other technology is really around just efficiencies and trying to get advisors actually doing what advisors do best, which is speaking to clients and seeing clients and giving advice, and not just spending all the time on compliance and inefficient systems in the background. So one advisor, one of these comments here, what they've really done is they've actually brought in third party. I think in this case it was at work, but there's a few different third-party players there, and said I've kind of professionalized that part of my business, and everything's kind of running smoother as a result. The third one, clients. Now, clients is a pretty big bucket. So it could include things like intergenerational wealth transfer, which we will touch on the next slide as a very key point as well. It includes behavioral coaching, millennials. It includes customer segmentation. But I think the one that's really interesting, that last quote, giving more and more millennials a chance, that's an advisor who currently doesn't have many millennial clients. Maybe through the families, yes, but they're saying, I need to understand this segment just because maybe asset allocation's different, sure, different age, but also do they have different attitudes to investment philosophy, different ways they want to engage with respect to advice and technology and that as well. So you've got an advisor who's invested in trying to kind of be ahead of the ball with the kind of next customer segment there. Now moving it just to the other side so we can pull up some of the others. These I'll go through quite quickly, just they're the kind of less referenced, but of course succession plans critical. We've heard a lot around succession plans. We think they're very informal at present. I don't think any advisors really tell us they don't have a plan, but then when you start to ask for details, not that many advisors are comfortable or feel like it's done yet. A lot of advisors saying, I think I'm working this out, I'm bringing in a family member, or, sometimes you get told, my son's my succession plan, but he's not interested. So then I don't know if that's necessarily a formal and solidified succession plan. Investments, I know, we've got some references. I'll kind of narrow it down mainly on the top ones, but we've had 3 different advisors mentioning hedge funds as part of their offering and that as a kind of evolution of their business. But the one that I really want to touch on in terms of advisor efficiencies and that is really around that model portfolios, the second bullet, and also the top one around moving away from fund picking. Is we've seen a lot of that shift to centralized investment propositions as part of, again, getting advisors, more in front of clients and talking about the things that really matter, as opposed to, having to work through 200 funds with 200 different clients. And I think this may speak to DFMs. It also doesn't have to, but it does speak to centralized investment propositions. And then the other one, offshore growth, I'm sure that's not crazy to anyone. We've seen a lot of structural shift, even if the offshore markets have been crazy. We have seen structural shift, setting up offshore businesses, etc. Professionalization probably links mainly to tech elements as well, but we'll talk through that on the next slide. And finally, culture and branding. So it's great if you've got this customer experience, but if you haven't really established what are your values or what do you stand for as a business and what does it graphically stand for in terms of the brand, then it doesn't really help if you're messaging all of that to your clients but don't yet have a message. So we think that links in nicely with customer experience tech as well. So I'll go. The second slide really looks more at potential avenues and considerations for the future. Now we've tied in, so obviously it's going to be a little bit of an overlap with the last slide, because if no advisors are currently doing anything that links to future developments, then we'd be a bit surprised. So it does link a bit to the last slide, but it also looks at some of the trends that we've seen play out. And I've used the UK as the main comparison market. So when I reference some percentages, it'll be UK referencing. Again, these are advisors answering in the UK. So you can think of kind of your equivalents in the UK answering some of these questions. So the first one, I don't think I'm very well positioned to talk about robo, but I think the one element that we have seen is that the robots haven't taken over. We don't think the robots are going to take over. And if anything, the ideal would be that you get them to work for you, right? So how does it incorporate into your business? We've seen various attempts at robo in the UK. I won't name names, but they really haven't succeeded the way that they were touted that they were going to succeed. But at the same time, are there elements that are going to be a little bit more efficient? We've got a hypothetical around whether robo is going to work in the long tail to keep that client base advised to some extent. Maybe, right? I think we're generally skeptical as a consultancy, but that could be an example. We've talked about the professionalizing business through efficiencies, and that includes a really important one there is the compliance side. Just because, again, getting advisors in front of clients, getting advisors actually giving advice, as opposed to increasingly just spending more and more time on admin. Client-facing elements and firms' brand and image. I'm going to come back to that one after we've just talked about the last one. Because every now and then we get this question, in the UK, don't advisors, do some of them own their own platforms, etc.? And here we've got some large advice networks that do have a platform, sure. But I think typically that's the one where we look at it, it's an interesting question because, what do we mean by owning the platform? Does it mean we want to do all of that large-scale, heavy investment, constantly changing administrative and execution elements of a platform? I mean, that doesn't sound very attractive at all. It doesn't sound like there's a lot of value in that space. But if you think about it, the owning a platform piece, what we have seen in terms of some innovation, and we've also seen it here in South Africa, is increasingly owning some of that front end, right? The reporting elements, the advice journey, and that makes more sense to us, right? And I think that's important is looking at this and saying, well, where do we actually want to evolve? Where do we want to innovate and where do we want to participate? Is it maybe it's around we're going to pull together consolidated reporting across the platforms, or we're going to build more and more of our advice journey branded our way in our thought process into our investments, and actually the platform just needs to execute on that for us. So that's where I'm just going to link a quick stat from the UK is 80% of the advisors, we speak about 500 or so, 80% of the advisors tell us they have a level of integration between the platforms they work with and the back office systems that they've got. Typically, that starts with the systems that everyone knows, the third-party ones, but for a large business that builds up their own processes, you can get integration into the platforms. The next, right, so we've talked a little bit on the tech side, we're going to the client side. I'm very glad that we've already touched very briefly on intergenerational wealth transfer. Now I've got up there that's a threat, and I'm just going to quote some statistics which I found very interesting. So we've asked the exact same questions in the UK and in South Africa, and overall the majority of advisors, the overwhelming majority of advisors say that it's going to impact their business. Intergenerational wealth transfer is going to impact their business. Now of those that expect an impact, in the UK it was 88% saw it as an opportunity. In South Africa, it was 60% saw it as a threat. And I think it was something like 15-20% saw it as an opportunity. So it's an incredible difference between the two markets. And it does make a lot of sense just for the kind of practical reason that when we ask advisors about it, they say, well, the next generation is immigrating or immigrated already. And that's why there's a bit of a threat. Some of it's a threat because they say, well, these guys are going to go and stock pick themselves and they don't want advisors. There's a little bit of that. But most of it is really the concern that there's immigration taking place, etc. And so the question is, is there nothing you can do about it? And I think there's a question, right, on going forward, is there a strategy? Now, the growth in offshore could link to that a bit. We saw a lot of businesses expanding their offshore operations or partnering in the offshore side. But also there's just a question around, are you doing enough yet at a family level of advice? Right, so maybe you're bringing the partner in, maybe it's husband and wife conversations, but what about that next generation, and are they part of the conversation even if they currently have no money? And so I think that's an interesting one because it does link to client segmentation approaches as well. It links to kind of understanding, what does my client base look like, and do we have to have a different strategy for different types of clients that walk through the door? So the numbers are rough, but I think it's something like 83% of the advisors we spoke to say that they segment their client base. It's over 90% for the younger advisors under 40. Right, so there's definitely segmentation taking place, but almost all of that segmentation, it's, I think, north of 80% of that segmentation is about how important is the client to you, right? What are their total assets, or what is their earnings potential, or et cetera, and what fees are you earning off of them? Now, we do think that's critical because it does allow you to change your service models depending on the value, but at the same time, there's not quite enough, we think, around age, life stage, and these kind of elements. Now, I'm sure that does come out when you're doing the actual advice process and you're talking about the investments that are right for them, but if you segment that at the high level, then you're able to look at it and say, this customer segment, we're actually going to take a different strategy with. And so we've seen about 1 in 5, it's not a lot, but about 1 in 5 advisors in the UK are saying that they actually have a different strategy for the millennial kind of segment in their client base. And I think that links to trends that might be linked, right? So ESG. So ESG, we know, we've spoken to the advisor the last couple of years, and we can't find a lot of retail advisors who think it really matters at the moment in the retail space, right? The majority of retail advisors are saying, my clients haven't asked me about it. The guys with money right now don't seem to ask me about it. But what we have heard increasingly is that it's the children of the clients, or it's the younger clients coming through that are starting to bring this into conversation a little bit. Now, I'm not really going to talk about ESG, but that's just an example. It's just that some trends may look like they're really not playing out, but they're starting to pop up in certain segments, and then the wealth transfers, and then that segment all of a sudden cares a lot, and then the question is, are you ready for that when that plays out? Behavioral coaching, just as an example, we've seen some advisors, internal behavioral coaching, just in terms of how they'll deal with their clients, but also coaching in terms of, part of their advice process with their clients as well. Then finally, business models. So anytime there's pressures or challenges in the market, RDR, COVID, there's a number, constantly playing out, there's an opportunity for growth as well. So we've got a stake in an advice firm in the UK called Black Swan Capital. They went from 3 advisors and 1,000 clients to 50 advisors and 30,000 clients just over the course of a few years as a result of RDR. Now, interestingly, despite capital being in their name, they used no capital to do it. They were just creative, they targeted advisors that were wanting to retire, and they came up with a good strategy for how they would bring them in and give them a succession plan, etc. And so, we're not saying, I think that model, there's a few equivalents that exist here, but it's just an example that, that can pop up. As per the last one, we've had whole segments of advice. Streamlined specialists who sit and do entirely remote sales of life insurance policies, never see their clients, buy leads from aggregators. You see some very creative ideas popping up, and in times of challenge, actually some businesses can double or triple in size or more if they actually come with a good strategy. But I think that does link to that second point there around that succession plan and just having your house in order. Is informal processes, informal kind of approaches and succession plans are fine if you're 1 advisor or 2 or 3 maybe advisors. But if you're trying to go from 3 to 50, you can't figure that out once the 50 have arrived. It's kind of having that house in order we think is a really critical piece around what is our advice process, how do we engage, what's our branding, what's our culture, what investment philosophy do we have, what is the succession plan, and elements like that. And just building on that, there's a lot more to it than the acquisition multiple. A lot of conversations we have in market are about 1 times multiple at this firm or 2 times there. To be frank, the higher we hear the multiple, the more concerned we are with what's going on. But we find there's maybe too much emphasis really just on the multiple and not enough around actually the differences between all of the different propositions, succession plans, and all of that as well. So yeah, I guess the summary hopefully of the last slide and this slide is that firstly, it's a success to have made it through the COVID period and to still be, with assets, with clients, etc. So firstly, it's a success. And secondly, while a challenge, and it continues, and we can bet that regulation is going to continue coming, etc. While all of that is a challenge, and RDR is a challenge, it's an opportunity for businesses to grow significantly faster if you're dynamic, if you're innovative, and you also don't waste your time in the wrong spaces and spend your efforts where it matters. And as I said, very happy to take questions offline, LinkedIn and email and everything as well. Thank you.
Sure.